John Wesley is known as one of the greatest religious leaders in history. His ideas revolutionized Christianity and had a great influence on all of Christendom as we know it. He was dramatically influenced by a life full of experiences from his time at Oxford University to his time with the Moravians in Germany. In between, he spent time in Georgia as a missionary to the Indians. Wesley's time in Georgia and with the Moravians was the most influential part of his life and the most pivotal time in his ministry. In his broad history of American Christianity, Mark A. Knoll discusses Wesley's time in Georgia. While Wesley's initial reason for visiting the colony of Georgia was to convert the natives. While in Savannah, Wesley found himself involved in a love affair. This love affair would serve as one of the many reasons he would consider the trip a failure. However, this massive failure was more than likely one of the most important factors in Wesley's eventual true conversion. He thought previously that he had been saved. However, after the complete disappointment of his trip to Savannah and his experience with the Pietists, he was convinced of a more revivalist conversion that he claims he has experienced once returning to England. David T. Morgan, formerly of the University of Montevallo, writes of Wesley's time in Savannah as well. Wesley was involved with a young lady named Sophie Hopke while there. He offered to marry her, and she rejected him, saying that she intended never to marry. However, she was just playing hard to get, and when Wesley was not willing to chase, she married another man to make him jealous. He was not enthused. Hopke then began to skip church services, and when Wesley denied her and her husband communion, he was put on trial. Before being charged, he left back for England. This story shows us just how much of a failure his time in Georgia was. He went from being a missionary to being on trial and in a love affair. It was not just a failure for his ministry, his time in Georgia, but also for his personal life. Adversely, in Edgar Lagar Pennington's article on Wesley's Georgia missions, he writes of a small success of Wesley's time in Georgia. He gives an account of George Whitfield's visit to Savannah and tells how impressed Whitfield was with what Wesley was able to accomplish. The connections he made and the followers he gained proved to be the most important part of his trip and would become invaluable in the future. While his outreach would be more prominent in the later 1700s, he was laying seeds here that he did not even realize. Pennington also shares an excerpt of Wesley's writings that give us a glimpse of how Wesley viewed his trip to the South. The quote reveals he was not satisfied with his work over the 18 months. In hindsight, this was probably for the best, because he would go on to build on this failure and become one of Protestantism's greatest theologians. Experienced author and journalist Stephen Tompkins, in his book John Wesley, a Biography, also writes of Wesley's missions to Georgia. On his return trip from Georgia to London, Wesley interacts with a pietist group called the Moravians. The Moravians had no fear of death during a great storm and sung hymns through the whole of it. This struck Wesley as he began to inquire at what kept them so calm. He was astonished to find that these people claimed such a personal relationship with Christ that not even death scared them. These Moravians would go on to greatly influence John Wesley and his revivalist ideals. Wesley would desire this same relationship with Christ from this point forward. In Wesley's journal entry from January 25, 1736, he discusses the storm. He describes the encounter with the Germans that would be an undeniable influence on his work. He notices their demeanor and how calm they are. He talks about the humility that they show. He sees these people's unwavering faith and goes on to discuss how he now doubts his own. This is a crucial time in Wesley's life, as he will expand upon the ideas that he learned when he returns to London roughly 2 years later. He then goes on to explain his encounter at Aldersgate and the warmth he feels that is believed to be this true conversion experience that he needs. Often considered the first United Methodist theologian, Albert C. Outler writes in his commentary of John Wesley's experience at Aldersgate. He discusses how this is often seen as Wesley's conversion experience. However, other than the explicit description given in his journal from May of 1738, the whole event is infrequently mentioned. It appears that as Wesley developed in his faith and grew apart from the Moravians He no longer wanted his first conversion associated with them. Wesley writes multiple other times of experiences with as much spirituality as he had at Aldersgate. This would lead us to believe that the event was crucially important in developing his new birth ideals. However, as he did develop, he would want to be separated from the Moravian radicals. The influence on the theology of John Wesley is really the highlight of this examination. I claim that Wesley was highly influenced by his time in Georgia and with the radical pietist group, the Moravians. Martin Schmidt, a German professor and expert of pietism, discusses Wesley's theology in his book, John Wesley, A Theological Biography. He discusses Wesley's idea on new birth experience, and that to have a personal relationship with God, this experience is necessary. Wesley's development of a revivalist denomination is a direct result of his interactions with many revivalist groups in Georgia and from his exposure to the pietists on his travels. He would also spend time in Germany with Count Zinzendorf, the founder of the Moravian movement, at his refuge Herrnhut. Wesley would spend weeks talking to Moravians that had come to live there. Another major tenet of Methodism that Wesley developed was the idea of small groups. Today, almost every denomination uses some form of small group. I have personally seen Sunday school classes and life groups in many different churches. These originated during Wesley's time in Savannah, Georgia. In his journal from April 7, 1736, Wesley writes about recommending small groups to parishioners as they divide themselves into small societies. This idea he would take back to England with him when he left less than 18 months later. It would become a surprisingly attractive feature of Methodism in the beginning. To develop a written list of John Wesley's ideals, he took the Charter of the Church of England and abridged it to make the Articles of Religion for the Methodist Church. This is a collection of articles on the doctrine of the Methodist Church. He retained the beliefs of the Church of England and removed all of the Calvinist influence to uphold his more Arminian theology. We can see here his beliefs laid out in article form. This simplifies the chore of inferring what types of influences he took to form his church's belief system. We can pick out specifically Articles 10 and discuss how Wesley felt about good works. We know he thought they were important, but not necessary to get into heaven. This is just an example of how easy it is for us to see that what he learned on his missions in America is plainly implanted in his life's work in the Methodist Church. Robin Skaggs discusses Wesley's theological ideas, specifically the doctrine of perfectionism, in John Wesley as Biblical Scholar. In Wesley's notes on doctrine and the New Testament, he cites very few references in the Bible to validate his thoughts on perfectionism. However, his many notes explain his ideas specifically on perfectionism and the idea that it is more a perfection of intent of the heart and less of the physical perfection usually associated with the ideas of perfectionism. The Bible clearly tells us that only one man was ever capable of true perfection, and Wesley, as a scholar, would have known this. In his sermon on free grace at Bristol, we see Wesley's rejection of Calvinistic beliefs. This is another one of the key factors that attracted Wesley to the Moravians. They too did not accept the ideas of predestination. Wesley preaches against these Calvinist views, and Methodism will eventually follow in this belief. Wesley also preaches against salvation through works. When Wesley went on his mission to Georgia, he originally believed that he was doing God's work and would in turn receive salvation. After his encounters there and then later in Germany, he learns that the conversion experience and strengthening of faith guarantees salvation, not works. The sermon also received commentary from the great George Whitefield, who heard him preach at Bristol. Reverend George Whitefield is respected as one of the greatest preachers of his time. He was well respected and well traveled. He captivated audiences with his revivalist sermons. However, on the subject of free grace, he disagreed with John Wesley. In a letter, Whitefield explains how hard it is for him to have to write against Wesley, but he felt he must. I believe this shows just how radical Wesley was at the time. Whitefield was so widely respected even by Wesley that preaching in opposition was controversial. Calvinism itself was highly debated, and for Wesley to be heard by such an audience and to be discussed by such a prominent theologian speaks volumes about the power of Wesley's influence through his sermons. Finally, C.C. McCabe writes on the greatness of John Wesley and his creation of Methodism. He states, "If this Methodist nation could rule the world for a few years, we would make short work of some of its great evils." John Wesley, we can see, was an extremely influential man. McCabe says, "Put John Wesley on a scale and weigh him, and there is not enough gold in the Bank of England to measure his value." McCabe himself was strongly influenced and states that Methodism had as many followers as England had citizens when Wesley entered Oxford. This reveals how influential both Methodism and John Wesley were. John Wesley is one of the greatest theological minds to have ever lived. His radical ideas led to a major movement and a huge break from the Church of England. His major ideas were influenced by his time in Georgia and the time he spent with the pietist group the Moravians. He was strongly influenced by these experiences, and we can see this through looking at how his beliefs developed and how he became so radical during his life. His ideas were revolutionary, and he has revolutionized Christianity.